Welcome to Rising Stars, where Miriam Knight, publisher of New Consciousness Review, interviews exciting new voices in the world of progressive and transformational books, films, and ideas, who offer intriguing perspectives on life, the universe, and everything in between. Join us as we celebrate the conscious awakening and explore many expressions of consciousness in action.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Consciousness Review. I'm Miriam Knight, and my guest today is Alice Rothchild. Alice is a physician, author, and filmmaker who practiced ob-gyn for almost 40 years. Until her retirement, she served as assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Harvard Medical School. She writes and lectures widely, and she has focused her interest in human rights and social justice on the Israel-Palestine conflict since 1997. She's the author of Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Story of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience, On the Brink, Israel and Palestine on the Eve of the 2014 Gaza Invasion, and her latest book is Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel-Palestine. She directed a documentary film, Voices Across the Divide, and is active in Jewish Voice for Peace. She just returned from her latest trip to the region, and I am very pleased to have her with us. Welcome, Alice.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, I must say that this was one of the most difficult books I have ever read because it was very personal for me, and we'll go into the reasons for that down the line. But first, tell me why a nice Jewish girl from Boston became a passionate activist for the Palestinian people.
Well, I think, I did start out in a very traditional Jewish home. I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week, had a bat mitzvah. We put quarters in the box to buy trees in Israel and make the desert bloom. And I went to Israel when I was 14, and it was this blissful family pilgrimage. But I'm also a child of the 60s, so I became much more involved in political analysis and fighting the Vietnam War and feminism. And I discovered that I hadn't learned much about colonialism and imperialism and all those kinds of things. So as I became an adult, I became much more interested in how the world works and looking at all of those forces. Having this kind of internal disjunction between my childhood love of Israel, which was this, mythical, fabulous place. It was, the ashes rising out of the Holocaust. It was all of those things. And then there was the adult me with my political analysis. And so at some point I discovered that there were a lot of other sort of Jewish progressives who were having these kind of issues. And a group of us in Boston decided to try to figure this out. So we started a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group, and that was an incredible education for us because we were meeting with Palestinians, and I actually realized I'd never actually met an Arab person. And we also were meeting with progressive Israelis, and these folks really educated us. And this began a whole journey. So we started sharing what we were learning with community activities in the Boston area. And we were very quickly blacklisted in our communities. And so a number of us were trying to figure out, this is really hard, difficult stuff. How can we talk about it? And we realized we were all physicians, a little subgroup, and we decided to start a health and human rights delegation to the region and to go and see for ourselves and work with different groups. And that started in 2003, and I started going in 2004, and I've been there almost every year since. And it's grown way beyond our initial efforts, and we did this until last year. And, I've continued to go without this group, but it was my entry into a very intimate and personal look at the realities on the ground.
What do you think were the main divergences between the story that we were brought up on and the story that you discovered on the ground?
Well, I grew up believing that Jews were always good people. My mother used to say, we're chosen people for a reason. It's our responsibility to make the world better. And for me, the idea that a group of Jews could do something that is of questionable morality was just not in my program at all. So discovering that, first of all, the whole history of Zionism, which is a long and complex history, did involve a very conscious effort to get rid of an indigenous Arab population that was living in Palestine. And, understanding all the reasons why Jews were fleeing anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and all that stuff, but also understanding that this then created another catastrophe for another people was the most stunning sort of piece of information that took a long time to get into my brain. And the other thing is that now that I understand that this isn't just, a problem that started in 1967 with the occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, but this is actually, what's happening is a continuation of 1948, that there's an ongoing dispossession and attempt to get rid of Palestinians and take land for Jews, that's really what this is about, is sort of the most intense piece of this conflict for me.
Actually, you mentioned in your book that the origins go back even further to the Sykes-Picot Agreement in, I think it was 1916, 17.
Well, the British and their imperialism had a whole, are at fault as well.
Well, it was the British, the French, and the Russians who decided to lay the groundwork for the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, and the Turks had really ruled the region for many, many years.
Right.
So it was a breathtaking arrogance on the part, particularly of the French and the British, in laying the plans for carving out their spheres of influence. And there was a subset of activists on behalf of the Jews, Herbert Samuel, Chaim Weizmann, and so on, who I guess were lobbying for Palestine, for a homeland. I think they started looking at Uganda, and then when that would have been interesting.
Right.
And
well, there's that famous story that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
There's this famous story that in the late 1880s or 90s, when the first Zionist Congress was held, that Herzl sent a bunch of rabbis to go look at Palestine to check it out, and they messaged back to him, "The bride is beautiful, but she's married to another man." So, these folks knew that there were people living in the land that they planned to take from the very beginning. And I think that that's, if you read the diaries of Ben Gurion and that kind of thing, this is was a decision that Zionists made. And I think it's sort of the bottom cause of why we are where we are today.
I think that's a little bit too broad brush. It's one of the causes, definitely.
Right.
But I don't think that you can ignore the Holocaust. And in fact, I don't think that you can ignore historical anti-Semitism. I happen to be from a family where, on my mother's side, we were persecuted by the Inquisition, and on my father's side, by the Nazis. So the notion of anti-Semitism is very real and really impregnated in our DNA.
Right. I completely agree with that.
So the question is, and I think the British government actually referred to it as, quote, the Jewish problem, unquote. What do you do with these fractious Jews?
Well, I think, there was a sort of Christian Zionist strain in Britain, and, there were a lot of people that were very happy to get rid of the Jews, and to get rid of them and put them in some other place was perfectly fine. So that's part of the bit of colonialism that seeps into this whole movement, but it's also combined with that European anti-Semitism. I mean, the problem for me is that the Arab populations were made to pay the price of European anti-Semitism. And, that's a problem,
Of course it's a problem, but it's not a unique problem. People with no power have been forced to pay the price everywhere. I mean, we have our own problems here with the Native Americans. We have our problems with the African Americans. So what we're talking about is really a very fundamental problem of power over people who have no power.
Right. But, the problem for me was that, and I don't know how you were brought up, but I was brought up with, that Jews don't behave that way. And I think one of the very important things to realize is that, we have our good traits and our bad traits, and we behave as well or as badly as anyone else, given whatever positions of powerlessness or power that we have. And, I think that that's a very painful realization for many people to come to. And also to understand that after the Holocaust, there are two kinds of lessons. One is, I will never let this happen to Jews again, which is a totally understandable response. But the other lesson is, I will never let this happen to anyone again. And I think that the Jewish community, and I don't blame anybody for doing this, but I do think the Jewish community chose, as a general group, that this will never happen to Jews again, and everybody else gets a lesser amount of attention. And I think that that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think it was Theodor Herzl who said that we will not have a Jewish state until even the prostitutes are Jewish. And I suspect that there are a lot of them now in the government. So we will pick that up when we come back. And we're speaking with Alice Rothchild about her book, Condition Critical. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Your conscious lifestyle on steroids. OMTimes Radio. IOM-FM.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hi everyone, this is Shay Parker, the host of Best of the Best, which airs live right here on IOM Radio every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific. I'm super excited to bring you expert guest hosts, spiritual discussions, free psychic readings, and so much more. I can promise that you will not want to miss this one-of-a-kind, fun, yet touching, down-to-earth show. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Pacific on OTR-FM. This is Shay Parker, and I can't wait to see you there.
I am Fidel Mshombo. I was born in a city called Bukavu in the Congo. We were a loving family, and then, boom, everything that I had disappeared in a single day. People think that when you are a refugee and they resettle you to America, and all your problems are done. They don't understand that that's the beginning of everything. I was not born a refugee. I was made one.
It's time we welcome refugee families with open arms. Learn more at embracerefugees.org, brought to you by the Ad Council.
Welcome back to our conversation with Alice Rothchild about her book, Condition Critical. So, Alice, you were saying before the break that as a Jew, you felt that we need to be held to a higher standard of justice and mercy. And I think that that is the mindset, that is the reason why so many Jews are actually active they were active in the 60s in the civil rights campaign, and they have historically been active for civil rights of minorities of all kinds. So how do we reconcile this higher standard with the historical reality of Israel?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is to celebrate our role in progressive movements all over the world and, the contributions that the Jewish community has made in the world. But I think at the same time, we have to look at this sort of blind spot that happens where many Jews are very progressive on lots of different issues, very sympathetic to lots of different peoples. But when it comes to Palestinians, there's no ability to be empathic and to recognize what Israel has done to the Palestinian community. And for me, as a sort of activist as well as a physician and a student of history, it's almost a cultural PTSD kind of behavior. I've talked with a number of psychiatrists about this. That as a culture, there's an inability to recognize the person or the group that has been actually that you have done what was done to you, and sort of the victim becomes the victimizer kind of syndrome. And I think that is sort of what's going on a cultural level. So for me, not only do we have to do political work, but there has to be some internal kind of healing within the Jewish community to be able to confront this and to make it right, because until we do that, it is just going to be ongoing trouble.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have had numerous discussions with various relatives and found that my opinions were not really terribly welcome, primarily because of the Israeli contingent are facing the real fears, sometimes imagined fears, but too often real fears of terrorism. And they look at their own children and so on and say, well, my children are more important to me than someone else's children. How do you bridge that empathic gap? I think your book actually goes a long way because explain to us how you wrote the book. I found it just heartbreaking and compelling.
Well, the way that I wrote this book was that for the last 6 years when I've gone, I found each day so sort of powerful, upsetting, confusing, disturbing, that the only way I could actually deal with it was to write. So every day that I was there, and I would generally go for 2.5 weeks, at the end of the day, I would just go and hide and write and write and write. So I ended up with many, many, many blogs, so blog essays that are basically saying this is what I saw today, and this is the feelings that it brought up today, and these are the people I met today. So it's written in the present because it's written as it happens. And so what I did with the book is I looked at all these blogs and I basically curated these essays. I took the most powerful blogs and I also updated them and I put them together so be if they were on the same topic and that kind of thing. And I also focused on the more recent blogs and also on the blogs related to Gaza because I'd been in Gaza in 2005 and then I was back in 2015. I just got back, but the book is already out. So there's an emphasis on the realities in Gaza post-war because people really don't have any idea about that. So it's an attempt to take the reader and sort of take them on the journey with me and to take them to a refugee camp or to, Haifa or Jaffa or whatever city I'm in and have this experience with me. And then I tried to weave sort of my analytic stuff in each chapter and at the beginning, at the end of the book to help people frame what I'm seeing and how I put it together historically and politically. So that's sort of how the book evolved as a book. But I am a believer that there's so much pain and so many hot button issues that make people sort of close their minds and their hearts down, that one of the ways to open people's minds and hearts is through the personal narrative. And I always say, you you may not agree about occupation or siege or whatever, but you can agree that every woman should have prenatal care, that women should not deliver checkpoints, that children should have enough to eat. I mean, as human beings, we can all agree on that. And then you can sort of step back and say, well, if that's not happening, why? And then it makes it more possible to have conversations with people that otherwise might be very difficult. The other thing that I would argue is that I completely understand that one's own children are the most important children in the world for oneself. The question is the behavior of the Israeli government actually keeping your children safe? So, for instance, I was posting a blog that I wrote on a day in Gaza with a humanitarian worker, and he was saying things like, if the children in Gaza had clean water, how would that threaten Israeli security? If we were able to fish in the Mediterranean Sea and feed our people, how would that affect Israeli security? All the things that are being done according to the siege are actually creating more desperate, angry, hopeless people. And so to think that that's going to somehow improve Israeli security and improve the safety of children in Israel, I think is delusional. And I don't think it's any different than U.S. policy, by the way. We're not any better or worse than Israeli people, but our Israeli government, and our government may soon be even worse. But I think you have to really ask, is the behavior of the Israeli government keeping Israelis safe? And I think you could make a really strong argument that it is not. And it's not that the Palestinians are perfect, but it is true that people who are oppressed will resist oppression. We would do it, and they are doing it. And so the question is, how do you move beyond that? And I think you move beyond that by ending the occupation, ending the siege, treating people with dignity, that's ultimately how the conflict could get resolved if it's resolvable.
I think there are so many levels of power and influence at work here that it very much muddies the waters. I remember post-1967, first of all, in 1967, the feeling of Israel, which at that time was not the affluent powerhouse that you refer to today. I remember visiting and we would have get-togethers where we would share a bowl of sunflower seeds and grapefruit juice. And the median income of a full professor was sort of what we would call a laborer here. And the feeling was after the 67 war that now, finally, that will bring the Arabs to the negotiating table and they will recognize Israel and then we can get over this. This was the narrative of the people, the narrative of the pioneers, the idealists who made Aliyah, who moved to Israel. Now, at a different level, there were the power brokers that you would call Zionists, the kind of elite on the Israel side, but also rather cynical leaders on the Arab side who found it useful to keep that pot boiling. And you just don't know how, at the people level, I think the people have been shown over and over to want to have peace. Of course they want peace. Of course they want their children to be safe and to be fed and to be educated. So what are the currents that you sense at a higher level keeping this pot boiling?
Well, you mean currently?
Yeah.
Currently, first of all, I think that we need to understand that behind the scenes, there's a huge military, industrial, prison industry complex that benefits both the U.S. and Israeli corporations and global corporations in maintaining the status quo. So there's a huge relationship between our military and their military, you know, buying weapons, testing weapons, all that kind of stuff. And that there are a huge number of powerful interests that like the way things are because it's profitable and because there's a huge amount of industry and global military interests that can be maintained by having the current situation. I do think then there is the whole impact of Christian Zionism. I mean, there are many, many million more Christian Zionists than Jews in this country who, from a very literal interpretation of the Bible, actually think that all Jews should go, quote, back to Israel so that there can be an apocalypse. And, you know, we're all going to die, but that's beside the point. And so there's this whole religious Zionist Christian element that has a very strong pull in our Congress that I think is also part of this mix. Then there are many, you know, the leadership within the Arab world is not anything to be proud of. And so a lot of leaders within the Arab world, and, you know, I'm not prepared to go through each country and how they use Palestinians, but Palestinians are used to keep the masses focused on something outside of the crisis that's going on within their own country. So, you know, that's just a couple of things that I think keep the pot boiling. And then you add a very vocal Israel lobby, which is both groups like AIPAC, which are sometimes to the right of the Israeli government, as well as Christian Zionists, that really keep Congress very under their control in terms of supporting, you know, what is considered supporting Israel, which I would consider not supporting Israel, but, you know, not, let's say, not criticizing the settlements. You know, just the recent UN resolution criticizing the growth of settlements. I mean, it is not a radical idea that the growing Jewish settlements within the occupied territories is a blockage to any possibility of a peace agreement. I mean, you cannot be negotiating about a future Palestinian state while you're taking it away. That's not a radical idea. That's been part of every negotiation for 2 decades, you know. But this was treated like some major, horrific, horrible moment and, you know, betrayal of Israel. I mean, someone is creating that message. And that message is partly through the Israel lobby, it's partly through the Israeli government. I mean, there's a huge messaging industry that frames what happens in a particular way that, in my brain, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, you know, there's so many forces going on, not to mention, you know, what's going on in terms of our military adventures in the Middle East, the Arab Spring. I mean, all these things then contribute to creating a very unstable situation that can be used and abused by leaders in different countries according to what they want their populations to believe.
Well, I was encouraged to hear on the news today that the Israeli Supreme Court actually has declared a Jewish settlement in the territories to be illegal and ordered it to be demolished. I don't know whether that's the first.
Yeah. This happens over and over again. I mean, if you look at the actual history of this kind of behavior, first of all, according to international law, all settlements are illegal. So this is an interesting use of language and now, you know, deciding what's an illegal settlement and what's an illegal settlement is an interesting framing for me. But if you look at what often happens is that, first of all, the military doesn't always respect what the courts say, and the settlers don't respect, you know, the more right-wing settlers don't respect anybody. So, you know, there's this sort of cat and mouse game that happens where a little caravan will be dismantled and then they pop up somewhere else and then, you know, and then 10 years later they get their permit and then there's a big settlement. So, you know, I think that's very nice that the courts did that, but I don't have a huge hope that that's some major breakthrough because at the same time, Netanyahu is giving all this permission to build, you know, thousands of houses in different settlements. And Bennett, the educational minister, is talking about wanting to annex one of the larger settlements and perhaps all of Area C, which is 65% of the West Bank. So, you know, there are these little moments, but if you look at the big context is a desire to take as much of the West Bank as the Israeli government can get away with as few Palestinians in it. And that's not conducive to a viable future for anybody.
Well, certainly when I lived in Israel, I was excruciatingly embarrassed when we would go through checkpoints and you would see cars with Arab license plates pulled over to the side. So that is the signal for our station break, and we'll pick this up when we get back. We're speaking with Alice Rothchild about her book, Condition Critical. Be right back.
Free your mind with OMTimes Radio, IOM FM.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free, ascendinghearts.com.
Grab a cup of tea or a glass of wine and tune in for Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Linda creates sacred space for leading female luminaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. A soulful venue where guests openly share the fears and obstacles they've overcome, wisdom and lessons learned, and the personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic, soulful living.
Sparky the Fire Dog here. Make sure your family has a fire escape plan, and they practice it twice a year. One important thing to practice is get low and go. If you see or smell smoke, it's important to get low and go. Protect your family from fire. For more information, visit sparky.org.
We want to keep you, your family, and your community safer from fire. This message brought to you by the National Fire Protection Association and your local fire department. Visit sparky.org.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Alice Rothchild about her book, Condition Critical. Alice, what is the URL for your blog?
Well, I have a website that is called AliceRothchild.com, and if you go to the website, there's a header for blogs, and there are all my blogs. And what I'm doing now is I didn't post my blogs in real time this January, partly because the sort of right-wing security apparatus in Israel is getting more and more freaky for me. So I decided to wait till I got home and then post the blog. So every day I'm posting a blog. I'm up to blog number 11. And, you know, all the blogs from previous years are also there by year. So it's all on my website, AliceRothchild.com. And then some of the blogs are being picked up by Just World Books and by Mondo Weiss. But all of them are on my website.
And we might add that she spells Rothchild, Rothchild.
Right.
No S.
Yeah. My grandfather lost the S on Ellis Island. You know, they Americanized immigrant names, so somehow the S got lost. And we're not from the rich family; we're from the settled family.
Okay. So I would like you to give us a flavor of some of the interactions in your book, because they make it so personal.
Well, is there any particular chapter you have in mind? I mean, let's see.
Well,
there's an essay about being in the Ida refugee camp in Bethlehem, you know, staying with a family, you know, and they have a whole bunch of kids, including a boy with severe cerebral palsy, probably from birth, you hypoxia from birth, lack of oxygen at birth, and issues relating to access to care that are related to being under occupation. So we were with this family. There was, there was a time when the Israeli soldiers were coming in every night and tear gassing the place, and the kids would get up and throw rocks at the tanks, and so there were skirmishes going on in the camp, and we were with the husband of this, the woman that we were. The husband in the family, and he had 40% of Palestinian men spent time in Israeli jails, and that's a whole other story. But when he was released, his prison sentence said that he had to stay in Bethlehem for his entire life. So he was basically stuck in Bethlehem where the camp was. And, he was talking to us about how he wants his kids to be safe and how he wants them to get a good education. And meanwhile, there's tear gas going by and there's graffiti on the walls, and it's, a dove with a key coming out of its mouth, symbolic of right of return. And there's all this sort of yearning and history in the camp. And then we have this cooking class with his wife who runs a little sort of business for internationals, teaching them to cook fabulous Palestinian food, and that is how they raise money for their kid who has cerebral palsy, who's basically spends his days sitting in a chair that's like from a car, and they have it suspended in their house. So he's 14 years old. He's a big kid, so they have him in this chair, and he's squawking and making noises, and the family adores him and nurtures him and takes care of him with almost no resources. And there we are cooking makluba and cutting up cauliflower and making basbousa and learning all these different tricks for Palestinian food. And then we have this meal with the family, and we're all sitting in this big open room. The son is brought in, and the kids are feeding him like he's a little bird. And we're talking about, their life, and the husband's brother and wife had been killed by the Israeli soldiers. It's just full of trauma, poignancy, love, food, all happening at the same time. And at the end of the stay, I sat down with the grandmother who was eating her makluba, and she just started to cry. And I just put my arms around her, and she's crying, and I'm holding her. And, this woman has been through so much. And, what can I say? All I can do is hold her. We don't speak the same language, but we're both mothers. Some of her children have been killed. She has this very damaged grandchild. And, her life is not the life she had planned on, or that she deserved. And, what I could tell is that she knew that she was not going to see any justice done within her lifetime, and that basically there had been just a lot of suffering and perseverance in her lifetime. And it was very powerful for me to understand the refugee experience and what it's like to have 3 generations of refugees in a camp, and people trying to do right by their children and get them to go to college and have a better life. And meanwhile, there's all this trauma and all this sort of institutional militarization of the occupiers, so that, it's not surprising to me that a 12-year-old picks up a stone and throws it at a tank. I mean, the only Israelis this kid has ever met are soldiers who have basically made his life miserable, and, oppressed people will resist. And meanwhile, I know that if the kid is caught, throwing a stone at a tank is, this is tried under military court. This is a major offense. This can result in 5-10 years of imprisonment, and there are a huge number of children that have been through the Israeli prison system. And, so you just see this very vividly in how it's sort of a circle of, violence and then resistance and punishment and deprivation and perseverance. But it's all very real when you're sitting in someone's home and, eating chicken. So that's just one vignette in the book. And this time when I was in the region, I actually got to go to the prison where the kids are sent. And it was an amazing experience to, first of all, be in this big open sort of court that, surrounded by barbed wire, where the families are waiting for their moment to see their imprisoned sons. And they're told what day it is, but they don't know what time, so they just sit and wait all day and smoke and wait. And, the lawyers come through, and sometimes the lawyers have met the prisoner beforehand, and sometimes they haven't. And we got to go into one of the courts. They're just caravans, or 7 caravans. And it was really sort of a stunning experience because it was a row of young men in shackles. There was the military judge and the transcriber and the military prosecutor, who's not actually a trained lawyer but just knows military law. And then all these lawyers milling about trying to make deals for their clients. And, there's not like a real trial. It's not like evidence is produced or something like that. And it all happens very quickly, and it's all completely banal. I mean, no one stops and says, is it appropriate for a kid who threw a stone at a tank to go to jail for 10 years? That's not under question. And so it was a very, the banality of it was very painful for me to see. And also, a good day for these families is, the kid only gets 5 years rather than 10 years. It's not, no one can step back and say, what is military justice and what does it mean to live under occupation and what is resistance? No one can ask those bigger questions. They're all focused on, can I touch his hand before he gets carted off again? So it was a very amazing moment, to be put in the context of all the other experiences I've had around military justice and the attempts to resist the occupation, which is ongoing.
I remember Golda Meir said in the last century that I can forgive the Arabs for killing my children, but I will never forgive them for turning my children into killers.
Mm-hmm. I find that a highly offensive statement. It's a way of framing this particular issue that is pretty appalling. She and Israeli leadership made a decision to dispossess 750,000 people and destroy 500 villages, and then they go and blame the victim. It's sort of a stunning framing for me in a very complicated piece of history.
Complicated indeed. Well, that's our signal for our final break. We'll be back with Alice Rothchild.
Bringing you the best of the conscious minds in the world. OMTimes Radio, your conscious lifestyle on steroids. Being a radio host on IOM-FM allows you to build your show on a rich platform with the power of the internet to fulfill your outreach goals and connect with a very specialized and global online audience, unlimited by time and distance. OMTimes Radio will provide you with web relevance, a recognizable conscious brand, and with the standard of excellence that has accompanied every single OMTimes endeavor. Host your show with OMTimes Radio Network.
Today, my new dad threw a barbecue.
I burnt everything.
Ah! And then we played catch.
I broke Mr. Lewis's window. And then, somehow, my hand. My hand!
And then my dad even let me drive his car.
The hospital's on the right! It was a rough day.
It was a great day.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. Thousands of kids in foster care will take you just as you are. For more information on how you can adopt, visit adoptuskids.org. A public service announcement from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Adopt U.S. Kids, and the Ad Council.
Welcome back for our final segment. So, Alice, you just returned back from Israel, Palestine. What did you see in your latest visit? Is there any progress, or are things just getting worse?
Well, I think that, things are getting worse. In Israel, there is a move to the right that continues, and there's a move to separate and demonize Palestinians both within Israel and between Israel and the occupied territories. So I think things are getting worse in general. If I just think about the West Bank, the conditions are more and more restrictive. there's a bigger sense of hopelessness about any possible future. And so the conditions are definitely worse in the West Bank. And in Gaza, they're not as bad as they were in 2015 right after a devastating war, but it means that it went from totally terrible to just slightly totally terrible. So, for instance, in Gaza, people don't have regular electricity. Sometimes it's on for 4 hours, sometimes 6 hours, sometimes 12 hours. It's totally erratic. And there's still tens of thousands of people who have not had their homes rebuilt. There's still fresh sewage pouring into the Mediterranean because the treatment plants were bombed, and there's very little functional infrastructure. I mean, all of that is still terrible. Now, when I talk to people, 2 years ago in 2015, the first thing they had to tell me was what happened during the war. So I got an outpouring of these incredibly painful, frightening stories of people who survived the war, and often had many, many family members who did not survive. Now that's not the first thing that people talk about. It does come up after a while, after, the no electricity and the lack of housing and the traumatized children and all the things that are sort of ongoing, and the, massive unemployment, and the totally dysfunctional lack of civil, governmental society and structure. But then the war comes up after that. So it's generally worse. And so it's a pretty disturbing and troubling place to visit. And in the midst of all of this, I meet incredible people. And so there's this disjunction between the resilient, incredible people and the fact that the facts on the ground are getting worse. Now, for Jewish Israelis, it's a whole different kind of experience because, it's a complicated society. There are, Ashkenazi elite type Jewish Israelis who are actually doing quite well. There's a big divide between the Mizrahi Israelis and the Ashkenazi Israelis. There's a lot of, endemic racism within Jewish society, as well as towards the 20% of Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship, or 20% of Israeli citizens who are Palestinian. I mean, it's a very complicated society itself, and there are huge questions about the loss of the safety net and the rising price of living and the lack of housing, and all those issues are going on within Israeli society that have nothing, or have not nothing to do with occupation, but are an issue for the country itself. I think everything has to do with the occupation because of the huge military budget and because the settlements are very costly to the state because they subsidize the settlements along with all the military support that they get. So everything, I think, ultimately is related to the fact of occupation, but that's not obvious to people who are, troubled about the fact that their medical copays have gone up and they can't find good housing and all the usual things that people worry about just trying to live their lives. One of the very interesting things that happened was, there's been this sort of steady numbers of people who have basically been, I would call it extrajudicial assassination. So people, Palestinians who have been shot by Israeli soldiers. And so there is a whole move to displace Bedouins who live in the Negev who are Israeli citizens and to destroy their villages. So one of the villages had been, the troops had come in to destroy the village, and there had been a Bedouin who was a very esteemed teacher. He was a father of 12. He was a nonviolent person, and he was literally driving away from the demolition, and he was shot by an Israeli soldier, and his car lost control and hit up Israeli policeman and killed him. And this was framed by the Israeli government as, an ISIS terrorist kills, rams Israeli policemen and yada, yada, yada. But there's video to show that it actually didn't happen that way. So I went to a protest in Jaffa the next day, and it was fascinating because the protest was in Arabic. So it was Arab citizens of Israel having a protest about this killing, and it was young people. And young people finding their voice is a new phenomenon, and being public about it was very interesting to me to witness. There were some, old lefty Jewish Israelis there, but mostly it was young citizens of Jaffa, where there's a big Palestinian population, just saying, no to these kind of killings. And that was a new piece for me, because the Israeli left is pretty marginalized, and the Israeli Arab left is continuously under attack and has a lot of trouble getting itself together and being brave enough to face the forces that it has to face within the society. So that was different. But an Israeli a Palestinian member of the Knesset was shot in the head in one of these demonstrations, and so it's like those folks are under tremendous attack and don't get a lot of sympathy from the Jewish Israeli society.
Mm. Well, don't forget that Yitzhak Rabin was also shot in the head.
Right.
Anyway.
Right.
By the Israelis.
Right.
By the Israeli right.
Like I said, it's a very complex society with a lot of different forces.
Did you see any movement among Israeli Jewish supporters of the Palestinian cause? Is that faction growing at all?
That's a pretty marginalized group. I don't think it's growing. I met a couple of people from that part of the society, but that's a very marginalized group. I did meet with Physicians for Human Rights Israel, which is a totally inspirational group for me since I'm a physician, and these are physicians and other healthcare workers who do extraordinary work. Not only do they do work in the occupied territories, but they also do work within Israel with, people who are marginalized, who can't afford health care, people who are undocumented, people who are in prison. I mean, they do attend to all the disenfranchised within Israel as well as within the occupied territory. So they're a phenomenal group, and they continue to do their work. They're also very unpopular within general Israeli society. So, you have those moments of inspiration, but they're certainly not the dominant voice within society. The dominant voice is really turning to the right.
Well, I get the sense that this is just part of a global shift to the right. We see it in Europe, we see it in America, and I'm wondering if it just has to get so bad that we all wake up to our essential connectedness.
I don't know what's going to make us all wake up. I mean, one of the things that I find very inspirational is the boycott, divestment, sanction movement that was called in 2005. Because, people often attack me for this, and I say, look, when Palestinians resist violently, they're attacked, and here they're resisting nonviolently. So you can't have it both ways. So I think that is a movement that is going to put more and more political pressure on the Israeli government, and it's a nonviolent movement, and it's an international movement. So that is a little piece that I think is very inspirational. I think, of course, all of the moves to the right are interconnected in this universe that we live in. But I do think, even looking in the U.S., I mean, we have to remember that Trump was elected by something like 20%, 25% of the population. So it's not like the majority of Americans have moved to the Trumpian universe. I think it's important to look at, what's happening in each individual country where racism and intolerance and all those kinds of things are erupting with tremendous force, but also to look at what happened in each country. So in our country, he was elected by the Electoral College, not by the American people. I think it's important to remember that, and also to be inspired by the massive amount of demonstrations and petitions and all the things that are going on that show that, there are huge numbers of Americans that are very unhappy with the direction he's taking the country, and that's where our inspiration should come from.
I think another source of inspiration you cover very well in your book, which is the incredible resilience and goodness of so many Palestinian people coming back, and even though they could find their own homes in the West, professionals, medical doctors, and other kinds of professionals, they choose to stay in the Gaza, what really is a concentration camp.
Right.
And
yeah, I mean, that's
work for other
amazing.
people.
Yeah, right. I mean, there is overall a massive brain drain. You know, people who can get out tend to want to get out, but there are also people who are dedicated, who stay and are enormously resilient. And again, I think they're very inspirational as well.
And the other thing we don't focus on are the real stories that you tell in your book of everyday living and struggle to overcome PTSD, to raise your children, you know, and enable them to somehow transcend the horror and the ugliness they see around them all the time.
Right.
Through arts therapy, through music therapy and theater therapy and so on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also the family structure is very powerful, yeah. Oh, it's very depressing, and it's very, I mean, I always come home kind of with my own little private PTSD syndrome because it's sort of stunning that this is going on. But, you know, there are all sorts of things, for instance, in our own country, you know, the racism within our own country, what's going on for, you know, children in urban settings that are poor and that suffer from institutional racism. I mean, we all have to deal with these kinds of struggles, and for some places it's much more extreme, like in Gaza. But it's not, you know, it's stuff that we all have to be dealing with.
Yeah. Well, I'm afraid that's our show for today. Alice, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
We've been speaking with Alice Rothchild, AliceRothchild.com, about her book, Condition Critical. I hope you'll join us next week. Thank you for listening. I'm Miriam Knight. Many blessings. Goodbye.